Every human being has three lives. They have a public life, a private life, and a secret life. The tradecraft technique to win control over somebody is to get them to let you into this. If you're not the one in control, then the question you should be asking yourself is, who is the one in control? When CIA taught me that concept, it was uncomfortable until I learned that it's true.
And this is basic tradecraft because you're trying to control people or understand people?
In espionage, you're controlling people. That's exactly what you do.
And so you're taught to get inside people's heads and fuck with them.
With a purpose, yeah. The dark part is when you realize that you like it, or that you enjoy it, or that you see the benefit of it. Because then you start asking yourself if there's something wrong with you.
So my data is being tracked by intelligence services.
If I sat in China or Russia or Israel, I would make you a priority target. Telegram goes to the Russians, WhatsApp goes to the Chinese, Signal goes to the Israelis. Whenever people call this an unprovoked war, it's flat out wrong. It is absolutely a provoked war.
Is there going to be a tactical nuclear weapon deployed in Ukraine? Because that's when everyone pays attention.
If a nuclear weapon goes off, Russia already knows they're going to get the blame. They also know that anybody out there, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, some transnational threat, if anybody wants to really make a mess of the world right now, they just have to set off a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Economists are saying that by 2032, the United States will no longer be the world's economic superpower.
Let's project forward then. What does the world look like in, say, 2075?
Chinese becomes the language of business. The One China policy has made it so there's a dearth of Chinese women. What's going to happen is mass growth of the mixed race Chinese. Your Chinese African Americans, your Chinese Latinos, your Chinese Americans. So you would actually physically see more Asian blood in more bloodstreams. So by 2075, from the way that we look, to the language that we talk, to the way that we do business, would be significantly different.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Andrew Bustamante, the decorated U.S. Air Force combat veteran, former CIA intelligence officer, author, and award-winning speaker. In 2007, you became the youngest U.S. Air Force officer in history to command 200 nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles from an underground bunker with the highest military security clearance possible. You then spent the next 7 years working as a covert operative for the CIA, assuming numerous identities and working undercover to foil terrorist plots and steal foreign secrets. Today, you use the mental, physical, and social spy skills you learned at the CIA as a private intelligence consultant, and you believe that anyone is capable of mastering their mind, leveraging their talents, achieving their potential, and becoming a hero. All it takes is the right training and hard work. Andrew, welcome to London Real.
Wow, Brian, you make me sound really cool.
You are cool.
I feel really good about myself right now. It's like my kids need to hear this.
This is a technique the CIA probably uses, right, to lead people. But it's great to have you here. So much to talk about.
I appreciate it.
And I don't really know where to start. I was going to start off with like top 3 things happening in the world right now. I'm sure we're going to get into what's happening now nearby in Ukraine because you're a bit closer to the situation, what's going on with China, et cetera. But I thought I might actually start with the World Cup because the first match starts in a couple days and the whole world's watching. It's usually a time when people celebrate and look at this, except for this one's getting a little more criticism. And from you, from a geopolitical perspective, I'm curious, what do you see going on there? If there is anything going on there to kind of note of what's happening.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the World Cup is it's in Qatar, correct?
Yeah.
And I remember when it was announced to be in Qatar, there was there was a little bit of a spike in attention because folks were like, how are you gonna host it in the Muslim world? How are you gonna host it in a Khaliji country, like an oil-rich country? There was a lot of questions when it first came out, and it's really fascinating. Football as it's properly known, soccer as it's known in the United States, is this phenomenon that is so important to most of the world and basically unknown in many ways to the United States, specifically where I'm from. So it's really hard to have a football conversation with anybody in the United States. And they most definitely don't realize that the World Cup is happening. It's happening in Qatar, and it's a big deal. The things to watch out for, I know some friends in the private intel world who are specifically focused on the security and the counter-terrorism aspects of hosting something in Qatar. You've got the Sunni Shia issues with that. You've got the world politics issues with that. You've got geopolitics because who gets to play, who doesn't get to play. Does Qatar decide? Does FIFA decide? Do politicians decide? It's a challenging situation. But at the same time, the way I tend to look at any kind of sporting event is that sporting events are designed to be an escape from the noise, right? It's a chance for us to just put sportsmanship first instead of showmanship. And we should celebrate the athletes. The athletes, they're not the ones causing conflict. The athletes are out there busting their asses, man, working hard to master complicated techniques, work as a team, represent their country on a world stage. And my hope is that we'll have an excellent World Cup. The infrastructure looks spectacular because Qatar has gone to great lengths to make it happen. So I'm hoping for positive things.
Yeah, it should be interesting to watch. I know it's been quite controversial, and people are saying, did they win it properly? And then all the human rights things are under the microscope, and there's a lot of people talking. But I got a funny feeling once the soccer gets going or the football gets going, people will check it. But yeah, it is a great distraction for the world. But also there's a lot of political things going on, as there are with Olympics, right? You want to win because it can take a lot of heat off your country or bring you a lot of prestige, as the Olympics can help. I mentioned Ukraine. You're closer to it now here, and I'm wondering, what are your views on what's happening with Ukraine and Russia? You see things from a completely different picture than most people see things, because you know a lot more what's going on inside, longer-term visions, things from a geopolitical standpoint. What do you see when you see what's going on in Ukraine, and what do you think that most people don't see when they read the headlines and hear all of the scenarios? The latest thing was World War III was trending on Twitter a couple days ago, and I'm in chats with crypto people, and they're talking about the nuclear fallout and where it's going to go around the world. It's going to India, and people are planning for this. What do you make of it?
Yeah, being in Europe, being in the UK versus being in the United States, and while I am closer now physically, it still seems like, in many ways, the war is still very far from the everyday person's life. In the United States, we really don't feel the Ukraine conflict at all. The average American does not feel it at all. We have very little reliance on Russia for anything. If anything, our economy is benefiting from Europe's sanctions against Russia, because now that creates a vacuum of resources in Europe, and the most logical person for them to turn to, or the most logical country for them to turn to for that vacuum of resources is the United States. So we have increased supply routes for liquid natural gas. We've got increased supply routes for shipping weapons. We've got more and more reliable, or more and more people depending on us in Europe than we did prior to the 24th of February.
Right.
So in the United States, it's the war in Ukraine is a very good thing for the United States. And I think that's something that most people are either glazing over or outright ignoring, that there is really nothing but net benefit every day that this conflict lasts for the United States.
I love how you just cut through and just say things like this, Andrew. I hadn't really thought of it that way, but like you said, it's so separated. I bet most people in America couldn't point out where it is on a map.
Yeah.
Right? And for them, it's so far over there, don't really know what's going on. No dependencies for natural gas, no real worries about Russia doing anything, no history of Russia ever coming through and wreaking havoc anywhere.
If anything, Russia and the United States were allies during World War II. And that's another thing that people are missing. Russia hasn't changed much. They were the same country that in World War II fought for the Allied powers with one gun for every 2 soldiers. They were heroes. At one time in world history, the Russians were heroes. they would literally put a guy with a gun, and behind him would be a guy with no gun, and the guy with no gun's job was to pick up the gun when the dude with the gun died. They are very skilled at wars of attrition. They are very patient. They are built of a different type of culture when it comes to protracted long-term conflicts, which is what Ukraine is. People keep thinking that Ukraine it's in multiple phases. When you look at conflicts, all what's known as interstate conflict between two sovereign nations, interstate conflict is protracted. Look at what the United States did when it invaded Afghanistan. Look at what the United States did when it invaded Iraq. Look what happened when Russia invaded Georgia. Look what happened when Russia invades Ukraine, right? Conflicts take a long time. The first strategy was kind of a shock and awe strategy. It didn't work. It didn't work not just to the Russian surprise, but to NATO's surprise and the United States' surprise. I'm pretty sure Zelensky was surprised. There was a lot of people surprised by, wow, we just resisted their assault on Kiev, or Kyiv as they want to call it now, because it's the Ukrainian, right? The Ukrainian name of it.
And why did that happen? Do we know?
Why did it fail?
Yeah.
Strategically, so Putin became very good at a certain model of conflict. It worked in Georgia, it worked in Crimea, 2008, 2014, where he basically corrupted senior officials from inside. So then when Russia announced that they were coming in, those senior officials would bow immediately, right? It was an administrative takeover, very similar to what China did in Hong Kong in 2019. When the administrators subjugate themselves, then nobody else has a say. They didn't have that network in place in Ukraine. So
and it's bigger, too.
It's bigger
than Crimea or Georgia.
Correct. It's much bigger. But you also have this history of Ukraine's application process to NATO and NATO's relationship with Ukraine. Whenever people call this an unprovoked war, it's flat out wrong. It is absolutely a provoked war. Ukraine has been applying to NATO. NATO's been dancing with Ukraine about joining. Russia's been very clear since 2011 that would be seen as a threat. Russia's been very, very clear for a long time that NATO expansion to the east is a non-starter for them, and they see it as an existential threat.
Right.
And they are technically correct that
it is, right?
Correct. They are technically correct that at the beginning of NATO agreed that it would not move further east than what was at the time the Soviet Union.
Right.
But with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, now that changed the charter, right? So now, do they treat former Soviet states as Europe, or do they treat former Soviet states as the original terms? So it took them 6 years to decide. From 91 to 97 was this very confusing time where folks didn't know, like, what do we treat a former Soviet state as? And then Russia said, treat them as Soviet, and NATO said, well, we might see benefit if we see them as Europe.
Right.
And
so
then
they started encroaching because Russia had less power then. So Estonia went and Lithuania went, and they started moving in a little.
And Romania went, yep,
right,
exactly
Romania went, right. But Ukraine is the breadbasket of Russia. It's geopolitically very, very important.
Correct.
And besides the NATO application, I'm sure some of your former colleagues are out there as well, encroaching and doing all sorts of other things from economic means or other means that just make Russia feel insecure.
Correct. And you're exactly right. It's the breadbasket of Russia. Russia as a country does not have the resources that it needs to sustain a first world population.
Right.
It has energy resources, but food resources, natural resources for construction, for lumber. It doesn't have the natural mineral deposits for gold, silver, coal, any of the rare earths that it needs. Those largely exist in former Soviet states. The reason the Soviet Union was functional for so long was because the industrial center was Russia, and it went to these Soviet satellite states for natural resources. So then the satellite states didn't have to develop an industrial base. They just had to essentially be a source of natural resources. So there was a symbiotic relationship that was there until it all fell apart in 91.
Okay.
So now you really do have to think about, how is Russia going to survive without, it's not like the United States that has all of its natural resources there. It's not like the UK that has fantastic resources there. It's not like Southeast Asia with fantastic resources, right? It's mostly frozen tundra.
Right. And the aggression was happening with Russia because Ukraine was slowly being moved away from that and moved to the West. Whether it was NATO approved or not, it was moving that way.
Correct.
And that was the low-level aggression for the past 10 years.
Correct. And there's a trigger point there, right? And especially a trigger point when you think that as as one former Soviet satellite state gains distance from Russia, other ones start to follow. So you've got Azerbaijan, and you've got Armenia, and you've got Estonia, and you've got these other countries that are watching what's happening and deciding, what do we do with that? Do we move further away? Do we double down on our reliance with Russia? What is it? How does it compromise us? What do we stand to benefit? And that's not a narrative that Russia really feels comfortable with for a long period of time.
Now, Finland just joined NATO.
So
It's a bit of a shock.
well, this is also what's interesting is that when you look at Finland and Norway, technically what they did is they submitted a rapid application, but it takes years to be approved. So it was very symbolic by virtue of the fact that they signed, that they applied, but it's been misreported, misunderstood. They're not part of NATO. They've just requested the review for NATO to accept them. And they've got a massive problem because Turkey has made it very clear that they don't have any intentions of accepting either application. And Turkey's kind of the thorn in NATO, just like Russia and China are the thorn in the UN. So Turkey becomes a very difficult win for the rest of Europe when it comes to getting NATO to agree on policy. And Turkey's got a strong relationship with Russia. They've got a history of their own internal challenges that make their incentives quite different than what you would see from Poland or Germany and the UK.
Right. This concept of geopolitics. Can you explain to people what geopolitics means?
Yes.
It's important. It's
Yes.
not really taught in schools, I don't think.
It's one of those things that makes its way into political science, and then the academic definition is different from the operational definition. So geopolitics is essentially the relationship between nation states as it relates to both their political endeavors and their geography, because the two play very different roles. You might be extremely aligned to another country on the other side of the world. Geographically, that makes it very challenging for either of you to support each other. Politically, you can support each other, but geographically, you're kind of alone. We're seeing that especially now with the rise of China, because China and the US stand at polar opposite sides of the planet, but also polar opposite sides of the political spectrum. So when you take a country like Taiwan that sits very closely politically with the United States, but very close geographically to China, geopolitics become a very important thing. If you think, a Chinese warship can cross out of Southeast China and get to Taiwan in 45 minutes.
Right.
It takes the United States 12 hours to get to Taiwan in a high-speed airplane. It's no-brainer how fast something is going to fall apart, right? And geopolitics has to come to bear. How do they?
And I want to get to China, but I want to finish up with Ukraine
Yeah,
because
yeah.
we will get there. And also geopolitics. From the way I understand, I used to follow a group called Stratfor, which is out of Texas, and I think they kind of changed it. But I always said that the politics is almost defined by the geography, which I think a lot of people don't think about sometimes. Like the U.S. tries to export democracy to the world, but you might argue that certain geographic reasons will never support democracy.
Correct.
And this is my question maybe about Russia. Russia is this massive expanse of land, all this crazy geographies and resources. Does it need more of a dictatorship to even function? Is one of my questions. And then also in the long run, they literally cannot give up Ukraine or they fall. So thoughts on both?
Yeah, you're right in a lot of ways. I have my father-in-law, who I will, to the day I die, I will love to disagree with everything he says, because he's my father-in-law. That's what you do with a father-in-law. You just disagree with them carte blanche. But I have to agree with him because he has this saying. He's a former Venezuelan. He's an American citizen who fled Venezuela and watches his country, which was a beautiful country in the 70s and is now a disaster, right? Just in a few decades. But he watches Venezuela and he sees what's happening in the US and he says, he is a believer that countries have the governments they deserve, right? A country gets the government it deserves, because Venezuela fell apart not because of politicians, but because of the people who supported those politicians. And that's just what happens. So whether it's democracy or dictatorship or authoritarianism, countries eventually get the country they deserve. So when you look at a place like Russia, especially when you look at what the United States learned in Gulf War I and Gulf War II. They learned that democracy was not going to be easy to export to Iraq. It may not ever take. And that with a strongman leader in Iraq at the end of Gulf War I, there was benefit to national security interests in the United States. And that's what people people always take for granted, because the narrative of protecting democracy is such a nice narrative, right? People don't realize that protecting democracy is not what we're actually doing. Ukraine is not a democracy. Ukraine was not a democracy prior to February 24th. That's not my opinion. That's studies and research done by the Freedom House empirically gave them a 3.8 out of 10 score in terms of democracy. It was a corrupt, poor Russian satellite state trying to decide what it wanted to be next, because just like you're saying, Russia it lends itself towards authoritarianism. It doesn't lend, to have a functioning democracy, you need to have a very educated foundational base of voters. You need to have technology and industry in place to be able to positively represent and secure their ability to vote. If you don't have that, you can't have a truly representative democracy. So it takes time to develop that, right? In the United States, as much as we love to talk about how awesome our democracy is, we were founded on the principle of you didn't get a vote unless you were a white man with property. That's how we were, that's the birthplace of our democracy, right? Race and financial soundness or financial well-being. Because the idea was, and democracy is always founded on the idea, that you need to be invested in the success of your country for democracy to work. If you're not fully invested in the success of your country, then democracy is bound to fall apart. When you're so poor you can't make survival happen, like places in East Asia, like places in Russia, like places in Eastern Europe, when you're so poor that you're totally ambivalent to what happens in government. You're uneducated. You don't understand the things that they're talking about. You don't have the technology to be able to track or keep up with what's happening. That's ignorance. That's a lack of education. That's a lack of resources. That's not the kind of person that can represent a democracy effectively. It's not.
Okay. And
that's what you see happen in Venezuela.
And so in America, we're kind of the do-gooders exporting our perfect system to the world, kind of like probably the Catholic Church used to do when they went into South America, saying we're just going to make all these people better like us, but we're not being very realistic about what's going on, or maybe even looking at our own system as well. It's not necessarily the right system for every place at this point in time.
Right.
That's a big thing to say. Most people in America would have a problem with that.
Yeah, most people in America do have a problem with that, but that doesn't make it any less true.
Yeah.
Right? And you're right. We struggle a lot with, especially the United States, we struggle a lot with the fact that we don't live a representative life compared to the other humans in our species around the world. Right. We don't. Our per capita income is like 400 times what the average poverty-stricken African or Southeast Asian earns. Like we are so far removed from real life that we don't recognize that our American existence is not representative of real life. And as I walk through London, I see the same thing, right? We're so far removed with our designer clothes and with our outstanding public transport, law and order when people cross the street. That's not how the world works. Right. That's how first world works.
Right. And yet we project everything on that rest of the world. We assume they make decisions the same way we do. And then we're confused when these things happen that we don't understand.
Correct.
Okay. And part of that is playing out right now in Ukraine and Russia. And so just to get back to it, with the Russian people, long protracted war. I had Bill Browder in that seat a couple weeks ago, who has had a long battle with, I guess, Putin. He had the Magnitsky Act that he put in place to sanction anybody to go in for their money if they were involved in, I guess, human rights violations. And he says that, well, Putin can't stop this war because if he does, he'll die. I mean, quite literally. Also in Russia, you don't see a lot of retired presidents. You see a few, but you're kind of in for life, because when you're not president, you're probably not going to survive very long. So again, do these all play into the decisions being made here?
Absolutely. So one of the things that the Western world learned from the global war on terror, which let's not forget that for 20 years we fought a war on terror and didn't win.
This happened at 9/11, it started.
Correct. And 9/11 it started in 2021. It kind of ended with that, or I guess even in 2022, we still had a disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan.
Right.
Right.
And when you were in the CIA, I'm guessing most of your work there was
correct
based on the war on terror.
Correct. Okay. What we learned from the war on terror is that the leader is the one that everybody focuses on, but is often the one that is the least scary. because that person came to be the leader, not because they were extremely idealistic or ideologically driven or because they were the most vicious, but because they were a unifying force in a panel of people that were much more diverse, which means that behind Putin, there are many, much more scarier, hawkish, violent, wealthy Russians. So if we see a change in power, if that actually happens, why in the hell does the world think it's going to be better? Logically, based on what we've seen in the war on terror, if we take out Putin, or if political pressure takes out Putin, it's going to take someone more ruthless and stronger than Putin to calm the people after that. That's not going to be a good thing for the West. That's not going to be a good thing for Ukraine. That's not going to be a good thing for any country other than Russia. And especially when we think through the eyes of a Russian. The Russians, they don't think that this is like a political fight over Ukraine. They think this is the West trying to eradicate Russia. And when you think about it, they have grounds to think that way. That is absolutely, this has gone from being a neo-Nazi narrative to 100% anybody can see. This is a Western war waged against Russia through Ukraine.
And has that narrative changed? It started as neo-Nazis in Russia, and is it now the West?
And you know who changed it was Putin.
Putin, right.
Putin changed it, and his own propagandists changed it. Like the West has played into...
Is that by design?
No. Maybe it was by design. I mean, the guy's a very skilled former KGB officer, right? But the point is, he couldn't back up the claims that they were going into Ukraine to purify Ukraine of neo-Nazis. It was such a ridiculous claim.
I hear that's still being, touted in the Telegram groups in Russia.
Yeah, and they still try, right? But that's a very narrow group of people that's why there was not widespread Russian support at the beginning.
Okay.
But as sanctions are leveraged that hurt everyday people, as sanctions are now, this last week we started seeing that the UN, or that the US was calling on the UN to sanction non-Russian countries and non-Russian people who have business dealings supporting the Russian side. Now we're not even targeting Russia. Now we're targeting the people who are supporting Russia. What does that have to do with Ukraine? If you stop the flow of food and money and weapons and the development of commerce in Russia, all you're doing is hurting Russia. You're not helping Ukraine unless you land on the conclusion that hurting Russia is helping Ukraine. And if that's the conclusion you land on, then who are you really fighting? Russia, right? So it's a sad state of affairs because now the narrative has changed in Putin's favor. He can now be honest with his own people. Before he had to lie to his people. Right. Now he can be honest with the people. And if you were faced in a situation where you were being targeted exclusively because you were American or exclusively because you were British, that changes the intimacy of that conflict for you, right? Okay.
Is the West trying to crush Russia?
Absolutely.
Always have been?
Always have been.
But they're not as relevant as they used to be. They're not developing with technology. Their resources are dwindling. They're no longer a major global power like they were in the 80s and 90s when, I grew up. Right?
In the eyes of national security, in the eyes of the way that the larger geopolitical infrastructure views geopolitics, there's only three what's known as global power competitors, GPC countries, also known as near-peer countries. There's only three. The United States, the world's current superpower; China, the world's projected economic superpower by 2032; and Russia, the number two exporter of weapons and energy around the world.
It's those two things. And the weapons.
Correct. And the fact that the United States sits in North America and South, it sits in the Americas.
Yeah.
China sits in Asia. Russia sits in Europe, right? It's got incredible reach, incredible power, incredible history. It's got a lot of potential to break things, and it carried on all the momentum coming out of World War II. Even now, we're seeing Russia a little clearer than we saw it before February 24th. We see where its military is degraded. We see where its weapon systems have degraded. We see some of the corruption that we've always known was happening in Russia, but now we see how it actually plays out on the battlefield.
Right.
I think China is seeing the same thing as they view what's happening. The whole world is watching because there's something to be learned from watching what happens when Russia tries to invade Ukraine. But we've also not seen Russia fully mobilize. If you recall when the United States went into Afghanistan, Operation Enduring Freedom, not a war.
Right.
When we went into Iraq, right, Operation Iraqi Freedom, not a war. The UN has gone on since to say that the US wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were illegal wars. There has been no legal war since 1947, according to the UN Charter. So when narratives say that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is illegal, yes, that's technically true according to the UN Charter, but no war has been legal. And what punishment has ever happened to any other country for waging an illegal war?
Right.
I'm all over the place, Brian, because the stuff you're talking about is so interesting.
This is so interesting. So, all right, what people really want to know is there going to be a tactical nuclear weapon deployed in Ukraine? Because that's when everyone pays attention.
Right.
Because that's when my kids start potentially breathing radioactive material, and it becomes very real and dangerous. Or at least that's what seems to be on people's minds as something that would be a game changer.
Yeah.
Because right now, like you said, most people in the West just don't care. You know, they might pretend like they care on Twitter, but they just don't care because it still doesn't affect them.
Correct.
So
here's what will not happen. You will not see a missile launched out of Russia carrying a nuclear warhead that lands in Ukraine. That's not going to happen. You're not going to see Russia launch a nuclear missile that lands in Poland or Germany or France or the United States. None of those situations are going to happen. Those are situations that stand no net benefit for Russia. Is there always a chance? Of course there's always a chance, a 0.5% chance, a 3% chance, a 1.2% chance, whatever. The probabilities are extremely low because that escalates things to an uncontrollable level, and that's not what Russia wants. Russia wants a long, slow burn where the rest of the world just slowly turns their attention away from Ukraine, and a war of attrition. That's what Russia wants.
And they just get it back.
And they just get it back. They don't even need it back.
Right.
All
just
they
need
need
the influence back.
All they need is the influence. All they need is one or two territories. They need Donbass and Luhansk, just like they were targeting in the beginning. They need a shadow government in those two places, and they need NATO to realize that there's no benefit going into Ukraine. No benefit giving Ukraine NATO status, because that's going to really piss off the Russians. And nuclear weapons are a deterrent. Right now, Russia does not want to go to war with NATO. If they make Ukraine part of NATO, that changes the calculation for Russia.
Okay, but NATO won't do that.
Exactly.
So the missile doesn't come from Russia, but it doesn't mean one doesn't get detonated.
Correct. That's exactly right. And that's another thing people don't realize. Russia's unlikely to create a tactical nuke that can be easily tied to Russia. If it comes in through Moldova, if it comes down through Belarus, if it comes in a briefcase, if it's a small yield bomb that isn't clearly nuclear, but detonated in a suitcase or underground somewhere in Ukraine as a message, what does that do? Unless it can be tied directly to Russia, it makes it very difficult for the legal structures of the UN and NATO to take action. And again, it's not a NATO country. Look at what just happened with the missiles that landed in Poland and killed Polish nationals. Right away, the world jumped on accusing Russia. The investigation later showed it was actually a Ukrainian anti-air defense weapon. It's also interesting that then Poland didn't hold Ukraine responsible for the inaccuracy of their own weapon. They still blamed Russia because Russia's the ultimate aggressor. If a nuclear weapon goes off, Russia already knows they're going to get the blame. They also know that anybody out there, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, some transnational threat, if anybody wants to really make a mess of the world right now, they just have to set off a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, or even just a big conventional weapon that looks like it could have been a nuclear weapon, because the whole world's going to collapse and make accusations faster than an investigation can be carried out.
What's the likelihood of that happening in the next year?
That's what scares me, because the likelihood shifts, and it shifts in wide shifts week to week. A week ago, 2 weeks ago, it would seem like that's the next logical step from Russia's current campaign of attacking infrastructure, right? They're currently in an air campaign, blowing up electrical grids and water grids and attacking the infrastructure, which again, people call illegal, but according to UN laws, it's still a gray area. It could be conceivably deemed as legal, because Ukraine has broken human rights and mandated that all adult men between 18 and 55 remain in country and potentially mobilized to fight. So
Have they? They
yeah,
have? Okay.
yeah, that's what they did back in March.
Okay, I didn't know that.
And human rights, that is a violation of human rights.
Conscription is?
It's because it's only for men, so it's immediately discounting women, which is not something that the UN supports. And then it's targeted towards a specific ethnicity and a specific group.
Russia.
Ukraine.
Oh, Ukraine. Okay.
Right. So now you're restricting freedom of movement of Ukrainian males 18 to 55 just because they're Ukrainian males. That is a violation of human rights.
Okay.
So, but we look past that. But my point is, 2 weeks ago, it's the next logical step. Now that Zelensky's willing to talk negotiation, like Zelensky's signaling that he doesn't need to see all the same stipulations that he was saying before, that de-escalates the conflict, which is what the whole world wants to see, is a de-escalation of conflict.
You didn't give me a number.
A probability?
Yeah.
So I would say right now we're sitting at probably like a 30% probability.
Really? In the next year?
In the next year, that you're going to see a large conventional explosion or a potential small yield nuclear weapon that comes from a non-Russian source. Yeah, it's
go off
1
there.
in 3.
1 in 3. And what happens with a low yield nuclear weapon? Like, we don't know. Like, is there much fallout? Is there radioactivity?
No, like low grade nuclear weapons are really what tactical nuclear weapons have become. They're essentially big enough to wipe out maybe 500, half a square mile, or half whatever that is in kilometers.
Is that like Hiroshima or something?
No. Hiroshima was a large
scale.
yield weapon.
And it was done above the ground.
It was a bomb, not a missile, right?
Okay.
So there's a couple of things to keep in mind with nuclear weapons. So the altitude at which they're elevated has a lot to do with the radiation footprint that they make. So the most strategic nuclear weapons actually detonate above, while they're still in the atmosphere. They'll detonate it at a mile above ground level.
Okay.
And then that sends a fireball at its maximum size down to destroy all of life. And a shock wave, it sucks the air out from the ground and takes it up into the atmosphere, and people suffocate. And then it irradiates the entire ground and then shoots all that dust up into the atmosphere. So when you want maximum destruction, you trigger a nuclear detonation at altitude. When you want minimum destruction, you actually detonate it at ground level. Because now at ground level, the ground absorbs the smallest footprint of radiation and irradiated energy, but the fireball still goes to its full size. So you'll burn everything. You'll still have a shock wave that goes, you'll still have a vacuum of oxygen that goes, but you won't have the same nuclear winter that you would if it was detonated from above. So, and Russia does not want to see a nuclear winter because predominant airstream will take it into Russia.
And they don't necessarily want to get it into Europe because you're going to get some very upset, angry Germans, and you don't need that.
Correct.
either.
And then the other thing to keep in mind is the target, right? What would be contrary to the narrative that's out there? Russia's targeting infrastructure. Russia's targeting military or debatably military targets. They are. When you've got a country that basically says that every male 18 to 55 is a potential combatant, attacking the energy grid, it makes it a viable target. Ukraine's decisions have given Russia the freedom to do the things that the UN and the rest of the world likes to criticize, but it's going to be sticky. When this goes to an international court, it's going to be very sticky. So the target of a conventional weapon, or the target of a low-yield nuclear weapon, it makes the most sense for it to be Kyiv. It makes the most sense for it to be wherever they believe the center of government is. Because if they can either shake Zelensky or neutralize Zelensky, who's going to step up? What's the next step then? Right? It gets hairy. It's not going to be a place like Odessa. It's not going to be a place like Mykolaiv. It's not going to be a place like Mariupol. Those are places for conventional fighting, but they're not strategically significant enough to warrant a large detonation.
Okay.
Right?
And now they're ruining their breadbasket, though. I mean, you take out Kiev, this country's got problems for 20 years.
Correct. Except that the Russians don't really mind that because they're just going to send in, they want everyone's will to break.
Okay.
And that's the Russian mantra. That's their MO.
Right. And they're not going to stop.
It does not benefit them to stop.
They're winning this war, you've said before, and they're going to win this war. And there's nothing anybody's going to do about it. And the U.S. isn't going to get involved. And Europe's not going to get involved because nobody wants to get their hands dirty.
Correct.
And we've all just recently had experiences like Afghanistan. And now we really know. Now, if we hadn't had one of those in 10 or 20 years, we might get some idealists to go in. But even then, they know better.
Correct.
Because it's just not worth it.
If you think about, go back to our conversation about the World Cup, all right? When a soccer match starts, when a football match starts, it's 0-0. Who's winning? Nobody. One team comes in, scores 3 goals. Who's winning? 3-0. The team with 3 goals is winning, right? Russia invaded. They took 74,000 square kilometers or something like that in territory. They're winning. Well, then the other team scores a goal back, and now the score is 3-1. Who's winning? It's really clear in a football match. The team with 3 points is still winning. The other team has 1 point. And even if they get 2 points, the team with 3 points is still winning. We see Ukraine fights back and wins a counteroffensive in the north. That doesn't mean they're winning. Ukraine pushes people back to the Dnipro River in Kherson. They're not winning. They're launching a counterattack. They're winning strategic positions on the field, but that's a long way away from pushing Russian forces completely out of their country and maintaining their own set of governmental leaders. If you look at those outcomes as the definition of winning, I think most people would understand Ukraine is never going to win this.
Never going to win this. All right, so in your mind, this plays out by it's slowly just fizzling in the world's attention, and they just say, oh yeah, that's that war zone that we're fatigued now of reading about, and we just don't care, like
Correct.
most war zones, and then it'll just go under their control somehow.
There's other things, there's other factors that weigh into that, right? Yes, the world is going to become less interested. The world's already less interested,
yeah.
Right? Zelensky made a very interesting and under-publicized statement right before the counteroffensive in August. August 29th, he came out and he said that he could sense that the commitment from NATO and the West to supporting Ukraine was fading, and that was a big reason why he decided to launch a counteroffensive. He needed to show battlefield victory in order to demonstrate that there was still reason for Western powers to invest in Ukraine. Because what he sees and what he knows that the average person doesn't know, the U.S. does not have access to the rare earth minerals that it needs to create new weapon stores. So it's sending all of its current weapon stores, along with the UK, to Ukraine. But we're not replenishing those stores because the supply chain to make new weapons is actually tied back in China, which has been on a zero tolerance policy for COVID and restricting its manufacturing, restricting the spread of supply chain routes for everything from rare earth minerals to stuff as common as steel. So we can't generate enough weapons to protect our own country. And that supply chain issue is impacting Ukraine. So we can still send them money, we can still send them humanitarian support, but continuing to create, they can't generate their own weapon stores.
Right.
Russia can.
Yeah.
So it's a terrible situation. I'm not a fan that it's happening, but realistically, when I think about what's in the best interest of the United States, what's in the best interest of NATO at different stages in this conflict, the shift away from it being in our best interest to continue supporting Ukraine is very clearly taking place. And politicians and individuals paying 400% more for energy in Germany right now, they're all starting to sense it too.
Right. 100 years from now, when my great-great-grandson is interviewing your great-great-grandson in this chair, are they going to be having a similar conversation about Russia and their power in the world?
100 years from now, that's an interesting question. That's an interesting question.
I mean, geopolitics would say yes, there's still these 3 major players. Now, maybe that could phase out, I guess, because we don't know what's happening with technology in the future. But geopolitics would say, like you said, Russia is the controlling force in Europe.
Well, it's the controlling force in Europe right now.
Yeah.
Right? We don't know what it's going to look like in 100 years. And the sanctions that have been put in place now are designed to hurt Russia.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.